In the history of the Beatles, nearly every album is treated as untouchable. Their influence is so vast that nearly every album they released has been elevated to legendary status. Critics analyze their records as cultural landmarks. Fans memorize every harmony and lyric, and musicians continue to study their work as the blueprint for modern songwriting. From Revolver to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, from Rubber Soul to Abbey Road, the Beatles' catalog is often treated as untouchable, immune from criticism, frozen in perfection. But behind the glowing reputation lies a truth rarely discussed. Not every Beatles album was loved by the people who created it. In fact, there is one record that caused lasting pain for two of the most important figures in the band's history, Paul McCartney and their legendary producer, George Martin. That album was Let It Be. To millions of listeners, Let It Be sounds peaceful, spiritual, and deeply emotional. Its songs feel timeless, comforting, almost biblical in tone. The title track alone has become one of the most iconic anthems ever written. Yet for McCartney and Martin, the album tells a very different story. To them, Let It Be is not a symbol of hope. It is a reminder of lost control, broken trust, artistic compromise, and the slow collapse of the greatest band the world had ever known. The project that eventually became Let It Be began with an entirely different dream. In early 1969, following the intense studio experimentation of Sgt. Pepper and the internal tensions of the White Album, Paul McCartney felt the Beatles were drifting apart. Endless overdubs, individual recording sessions, and creative disagreements had begun to replace the unity that once defined them. Paul believed the solution was simplicity. He proposed that the band return to their roots, four musicians playing together in the same room, performing live without studio trickery. No orchestras, no sound effects, no layered illusions, just guitars, drums, piano, and voices. The working title for the idea was Get Back. The concept wasn't only musical, it was emotional. Paul hoped that by stripping everything down, the band might rediscover the chemistry and friendship that once made them unstoppable. George Martin supported the idea cautiously. He admired the intention, but he could sense that something fundamental had changed within the group. The Beatles were no longer four young men moving in the same direction. Still, there was hope. That hope faded quickly. By the time rehearsals began, the band was fractured on every level. John Lennon was increasingly focused on Yoko Ono and showed little interest in traditional band discipline. George Harrison felt creatively overlooked and frustrated by having his songs pushed aside. Ringo Starr was exhausted and emotionally detached. Paul, fearing the group was slipping away, became more assertive, often interpreted by the others as controlling. What followed were some of the most uncomfortable sessions in Beatles history. Arguments erupted over arrangements, long silences filled the studio, enthusiasm was rare. The joy and humor that once defined the band were almost completely gone. Adding to the tension, film cameras documented everything. Every disagreement, every awkward pause, every moment of visible frustration was captured on tape. These recordings would later form the basis of the Let It Be documentary, offering the world an unfiltered look at a band quietly falling apart. For George Martin, the experience was heartbreaking. For nearly a decade, he had served as the Beatles' musical architect, guiding arrangements, refining performances, and shaping their groundbreaking sound. But during the Get Back sessions, his influence diminished dramatically. His suggestions were often ignored. The sessions lacked structure. Leadership was unclear. Martin later admitted that the project felt chaotic and emotionally draining. He would eventually say that Let It Be was not an album he truly produced. Unlike previous records where he carefully guided every decision, this one felt as though it unfolded without him. When the project stalled, Apple Corp's management made a decision that would permanently define the album's legacy. The tapes were handed to producer Phil Spector. Spector was famous for his wall of sound, a production technique built on massive layers of instruments, echo-heavy arrangements, choirs, and orchestral drama. His style had produced hits, but it stood in opposition to the original Get Back concept. Without consulting Paul McCartney, Spector began reshaping the recordings. Strings were added, choirs were layered in. Songs meant to sound raw and live were transformed into grand studio productions. The most controversial example was The Long and Winding Road. Paul had written the song as a simple piano ballad, intimate, fragile, and emotional. Spector turned it into a sweeping orchestral piece filled with violins, brass, and a full choir. When Paul heard the final version, he was furious. He felt betrayed. Not only had his song been altered without permission, but the entire philosophy of the project had been abandoned. He formally submitted written objections, specifically demanding the removal of the orchestration. His protest was ignored. In May 1970, Let It Be was released to the world. By that time, the Beatles were already on the brink of public breakup. For Paul McCartney, the album became inseparable from the emotional trauma of losing the band he had helped build from nothing. He later admitted that the album did not represent how he believed the Beatles were meant to sound, or how his songwriting was intended to be heard. George Martin shared the disappointment, though he expressed it more quietly. He would later suggest that Abbey Road, not Let It Be, should have been the band's true farewell. Abbey Road was carefully constructed, unified, and guided by Martin's full involvement. It sounded like a final masterpiece. Let It Be, by contrast, felt unfinished and compromised. To Martin, the Beatles deserved to end their story with dignity, not documentation of their breakdown. Ironically, the album was a massive commercial success. It topped charts around the world and produced some of the most beloved songs in the Beatles' catalog. To fans, the album felt emotional and honest. To its creators, it felt painful. That contradiction makes Let It Be one of the greatest paradoxes in rock history. An album filled with hope, warmth, and timeless beauty, born from conflict, exhaustion, and heartbreak. For George Martin and Paul McCartney, it remains the one Beatles album they could never fully embrace, not because the music failed, but because it captured the exact moment that unity disappeared and control was lost. In the end, Let It Be is more than an album. It is a document of the Beatles' final unraveling, a reminder that even the greatest band in history did not end with celebration, but with compromise, regret, and silence.